Welcome back, everybody. By now, you've probably understood that human thought and behavior is the product of both nature and nurture. And in psychology, we use the biopsychosocial model, the idea that all of our human characteristics are the product of an interaction between biological, psychological, and socio-environmental influences. Well, in this module specifically, this week, it's all about the biological. And in this video, we're going to discuss some of the basic genetic foundations that bring about our human characteristics. So first and foremost, let's talk about the actual blueprint that we are made of, if you will. So at the most basic level, you have DNA. And DNA essentially is the molecules, the actual stuff that we are comprised of. And DNA strands together to form genes. We have approximately 20 or 25,000 genes in the human genome, and this is the level of inheritance that we receive information from mom and dad. So we're going to cover genes a little more specifically. Genes strand together to form chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get 23 from mom, 23 from dad, and so 46 total brings about the blueprint of, the unique individual that each one of us is. All right, so this slide is an electron microscope view of our gametes, the sex cells. Specifically, you have sperm and egg, and obviously we receive sperm from dad, or the sperm cell comes from dad and the egg cell comes from mom, and each of these cells are comprised of 23 chromosomes. So the combination brings about those 46, and here we have an artist rendering of the 23 pairs of chromosomes. So 22 of these pairs are called autosomes, and the 23rd pair right here is the sex chromosomes. So X and Y are the sex chromosomes. If you receive an XX combination, you become biologically female, and XY results in a biological male. Essentially, this DNA is found in the nucleus of the cells of our human body. And there is, for all intents and purposes, an exact copy of this DNA in every single cell. There is an exception. Mature red blood cells, I believe, do not have DNA. However, DNA is found in the nucleus of all other cells, and there's an exact copy, and that is known as the process of mitosis. So when one cell divides into two, the process of mitosis refers to the idea that DNA forms an exact copy of itself. So that is important for a number of reasons, but in psychology, it allows us to study the question of how much of some human characteristic is inherited. And twins provide an outstanding natural experiment for us to explore the question of nature versus nurture. So generally speaking, there's two types of twins. You have the fraternal twins and the identical twins. Fraternal twins are helpful, but they're not as helpful to scientists for a reason that we're going to describe right now. So when you get fraternal twins, what you have is actually two egg cells fertilized by two separate sperm. And so fraternal twins share a lot of their DNA more than just regular siblings. However, they're not 100% identical. And if we turn to the idea of identical twins, they are known as monozygotic. So mono refers to one, and zygotic refers to a zygote. And so what happens with identical twins is you get one egg cell fertilized by one sperm cell that forms what's called a zygote. Now, typically in a regular developing human, the zygote would then develop into two cells, and the process of mitosis would bring about a direct copy of the DNA. and then those two cells would divide into four, etc. But for identical twins, the original zygote actually divides into two separate zygotes, and they each begin their own process of mitosis and developing into two separate humans. But in that original cell division, when one zygote divides into two zygotes, you get a perfect copy of the DNA. So for all intents and purposes, identical twins are the same person, genetically speaking. So let's think about some hypothetical situations. There have been plenty of case studies where identical twins are separated at birth. So imagine you have one twin who is raised by one family, they're adopted by a family in California, and another twin is raised by a family in New Jersey. Imagine that one twin develops major depressive disorder and the other twin does not. Because they share 100% of their DNA, we couldn't necessarily blame genetics as the cause for their depression, because if genetics were to blame, they would each develop the same disorder. Now, depression, of course, is not just genetically influenced, and it's not just environmentally influenced. It's nature and nurture. But these types of studies, known as kinship studies, allow us to explore the question of nature versus nurture because twins, especially monozygotic twins, share more genetic information than the average two individuals. All right, so let's cover one more idea when it comes to this, the influence of genes. So genes come in different versions, and those are known as alleles. Alleles, we get a copy from mom and a copy from dad, and what we're going to talk about right now is something called dominant recessive inheritance. So the textbook's example is a cleft chin, but I think another interesting example to consider is cystic fibrosis. This is a disorder that is influenced by one gene, or I should say one gene in terms of the pair of alleles that we inherit. So we get one from mom and one from dad, and these copies or these alleles can be dominant or recessive. And importantly, only the dominant allele will affect the individual, at least in one way. That's one way of looking at it. So bear with me for a moment. If I get two dominant copies, one from mom and one from dad, they are the same. They are both dominant. So they're the same. That is known as homozygous. If I get one dominant copy from mom and one recessive copy from dad, they're different. One is dominant and one is recessive. So if they're different, we call that heterozygous. All right, so let's look at how this might work with cystic fibrosis. And the reason we're using this example is because this is one of those characteristics that's influenced by one gene. Importantly, most of our characteristics are polygenetic. Poly means many. So things like intelligence, for example, there's no single intelligence gene. There are thousands of genes that interact to bring about our intelligence. But some characteristics are very straightforward, like cystic fibrosis. And so let's look at this right here. So we have two letters here, a capital R and a lowercase r. In this example, a capital letter refers to a dominant copy, and a lowercase letter refers to a recessive copy. The way something like cystic fibrosis works is you only develop symptoms of this disorder if you inherit homozygous recessive copies. What that means is you have to get two copies of the recessive gene. As long as you get one dominant copy, you're fine. You're totally protected. But based on these two types of parents, we can look at the odds of their offspring developing cystic fibrosis. So what we have here, both mom and dad are considered unaffected carriers. So let's break that apart. Number one, they're unaffected, and that's because they each have a dominant copy. Like I said earlier, as long as you have a dominant copy of this gene, you're fine. But they are carriers. And that refers to the fact that they each have a recessive gene. So although they are fine, they're not going to develop cystic fibrosis. They could pass on that recessive copy to their offspring in their sperm and egg cells, respectively. So, with these two types of parents, here are the 4 possibilities of their offspring in terms of the dominant recessive inheritance combinations. All right, so the best possible scenario is right over here. That would be if this baby developed or inherited a dominant copy from dad and the dominant copy from mom. So they're homozygous, they're the same, and they're dominant. This is an unaffected individual. This is the best because that means that not only is this person not going to develop the disorder, they're also going to pass on their dominant copy, one or the other, it doesn't matter, either this one or this one, to their offspring. So that means that their offspring, their baby, will not be able to develop cystic fibrosis either. On the other hand, there's a 2 in 4 chance, a 50% chance that these two parents could have a child that is an unaffected carrier. And that would mean that the child receives a dominant copy from dad and a recessive copy from mom, or the opposite, dominant from mom, recessive from dad. So those are heterozygous, they're different alleles, and the children are not going to develop cystic fibrosis, but they are a carrier of the disorder, of the recessive copy. Finally, I think you're starting to understand the math here. There's a 25% chance, a 1 in 4 chance that these two types of individuals would produce a baby with cystic fibrosis, because this would be the case where they get a homozygous pair of alleles that are each recessive. All right, so if we look at, for example, let's say these two individuals, imagine they're not siblings, imagine they are parents who are trying to procreate. Again, because this individual has 2 dominant copies, no matter what this individual would pass on to their offspring, the child would be protected. But, all right, so what's kind of interesting, I think, about this right now is that parents who are thinking about having children, they can now get tested for their genome to see if they're a carrier of the recessive gene. And so I think what typically happens is a mother will get tested first. And if the doctors find out that the mother carries the recessive gene, then the dad needs to get tested. Because if the dad is also a carrier of the recessive gene, then the parents might need to have a discussion about whether or not they actually want to try to have a child, knowing the odds of their child developing something like cystic fibrosis. All right, so importantly, some human characteristics, like I said, the textbook talks about a cleft chin. Some of these characteristics are really simple when it comes to our genome, when it comes to, single genes influencing our thoughts and behaviors. But most of what makes us human in terms of our complex thoughts and behaviors is polygenetic. We have 20 to 25,000 genes, and they are interacting in really complex ways. But what I want to end with on this video is just a brief note about where we are in genetic research. There are these major research endeavors, and one of the most famous is called the Human Genome Project. And I would encourage you to go to Google and just do some research on this. This is brand new research. We are at this frontier where we are figuring out, what do all of our genes do? What are they responsible for? So for example, we have identified genes that obviously, like I said, are responsible for cystic fibrosis. But we're also starting to see genes responsible for more complex outcomes like alcoholism and depression. Something like alcoholism, for example, we've noted that there are a few different genes that are involved. Aggressive behavior, a number of genes have been implicated. One of the most well-studied is MAOA, which stands for monoamine oxidase A. And what we're starting to see is that this gene, in terms of the alleles that individuals receive from their parents, it's correlated with certain antisocial behaviors like aggression. So we have a lot more research to do in this area, but the sky is the limit. I imagine that within a few decades, we will be able to, design our babies. Maybe you want your baby to have curly hair or, dark brown hair. These are things that we're probably going to be able to manipulate given our understanding of genes. But from a psychological standpoint, right now it's important to consider that this is the blueprint of who we are. All of our thoughts and behaviors are influenced by genes. But as we go through this chapter, do not forget about the influence of the environment. We are epigenetic creatures. That means that our genes are expressed differently depending on the environments that we are exposed to. So of course, nature and nurture matters, but in this module, we're spending extra time focusing on biopsychology.